It's a pleasure to be here and to meet people in Turkey and people from all over the world, really, because this is a special moment, as we heard in the comments that Professor Sayar has told us about the world situation. It's fortuitous that my talk really does address how we can use scientific methods to understand the root issues in these problems that we're facing. As an evolutionary biologist and a psychiatrist, I found that human evolution is really an important key to understanding the organization of human brain functioning and its treatment. Turns out that personality describes the way human brain functions or organized. That is, it teaches us about the way we learn and the way we adapt to stresses and challenges. It accounts very strongly for our health and well-being, for the human connectome, or the connections between different regions in the brain functionally, and also for even the way that we regulate with self-awareness, the very expression of our genome. Not just as a storage unit in the genome, but how the DNA code is interpreted and transcribed into active information to guide us in how to adapt and shape the very expression of this toolkit that we have within us. So I'll cover that, but first I have to describe a bit about what is personality and how it evolved. I'm sorry? No, I'm still on the same slide. How we adapt to environmental changes and how we've done so in 3 major steps. And measuring these processes in humans has allowed us to understand ways that we can actually measure the personality of our ancestors, because we've discovered how the genetic systems that regulate our personality and the way we learn are very strongly related to what we can observe clinically. And so we can use the genomes of Neanderthals and chimpanzees to actually measure their personality. And then we have to, in addition to that, ask why human personality has evolved the way it has. And we can see that there have been health benefits from increasing self-control and self-awareness that have resulted in our having much more pro-social behavior. That is a capacity not to act, as we're seeing happening recently in the world. And also that it promoted healthy longevity in people. As we developed self-awareness, we also lived longer lives. And we lived lives where we had more capacity for trust of other people. So I'm going to show you the evidence, first from evolution, that this occurred, and then from genetics. And I'm not going to spend too much time with brain imaging, but we'll talk about that more in the lecture I'll give on Tuesday. So this is a simple diagram of our evolutionary history from bipedal apes up to the first designated member of the genus Homo, that is humans. Homo habilis means handyman, because they were able to start making tools. Our next follower was Homo ergaster, which means working man. So that these were humans, early humans, who were purposeful, and they had a capacity for self-control, but they weren't really self-aware. And then Homo ergaster, the working man, once he moved to Asia, was called Homo erectus. But this is an advanced form of the same species. And then the common ancestor of both Neanderthals and Homo sapiens is thought to be something like Heidelberg Man. But this you can keep in mind as a major step of becoming able to regulate our emotions, to be able to be purposeful or self-directed, and then finally to become self-aware. Now, this is the first major step that occurred about 42 million years ago, when there was enough development in the brains of chimpanzees, our somewhat distant ancestors, and monkeys, that they started to develop emotional and social bonds, that when they were upset or got into conflicts, they were able to kiss and make up, forgive one another. We see this with two rhesus monkeys being encouraged to get along with one another after they had gotten into a fight. And here we have two chimps kissing because the female chimp had made the bad mistake of striking the dominant male of the group. And that's not something that leads to living very long unless they make up. But this was a beginning, not the full kind of cooperation that we have in modern humans, who can be altruistic, but it was the beginning of the regulation of social emotions. We also see a development in monkeys that goes back a long time, that they were able to learn skills and traditions. These are some Japanese monkeys, macaques, who learned that if they had dirty potatoes, that if they washed them in the sea, that would clean the dirt and also leave a nice salty taste. And this skill was acquired, it spread, and it still continues today. So there was a capacity for the beginnings of a proto-culture. But then we had a big leap with apes learning to stand upright on 2 feet. We see footprints from parts of Africa. And this is a reconstruction of a famous Australopithecine called Lucy. Here we move on a bit. We have the skeletons of Homo sapiens compared to that of working man, Homo ergaster. This is actually the skeleton, a nearly intact skeleton, of a specimen called Turkana boy from Africa, near Lake Turkana. And look at the remarkable resemblance between the bodies of our early ancestor, who was purposeful but not self-aware. The physical body has not changed much. This was a sort of a cousin who is built much more like Neanderthals are built, with a very robust chest. Then we have a comparison here of Neanderthals with Homo sapiens. Notice the more robust chest, generally more heavy set, quite a person who wasn't afraid to tackle large animals, but they ended up with many injuries as well. This shows the progression in the size of hominids from the early ancestors that I showed you, who were bipedal apes, up to the working man. This is a cousin of working man, very similar. And then we move on up to Neanderthal, Heidelberg man. And then finally, the size of the brains of Neanderthals and Homo sapiens is about the same. But the organization of the brain components is quite distinct. This shows that with Homo ergaster and then with early modern humans who were structurally like modern humans, but were not fully self-aware, we still had the capacity to use fire and to increasingly improve the quality of the tools that were made. By the time we get to this level, we're dealing with Homo sapiens who are behaviorally like modern humans that live today. Now, the distinctive features that distinguished behaviorally modern Homo sapiens, wise man, I wish we were more consistently wise, but hopefully we'll move in that direction, was the emergence of three things: science, figural art, and spirituality. Here we see two of those with 30,000 years ago, after the Neanderthals had really died out, we had modern humans tracking the solar cycle, the lunar cycle of going from a very small moon to a full moon and then receding and so forth. Here we have some beautiful narrative and figural depictions of the animal life in France around 30 or so thousand years ago. Here is the Karain Caves, which are nearby here in Antalya. And so I thought it would be interesting for us to reflect on how these caves, as many other caves around the world, have shown the same phenomenon. These caves were actually quite large, and they could support a fairly large group of people. This cave was inhabited by two different groups in different time periods, where Neanderthals, going back 200 to 100,000 to 150,000 years ago, left the skeleton of the cranium, and then also some of the arrowheads that showed their capacity to take flint and other stones and sharpen them for hunting tools. And then later, about 9,000 years ago, from you'll have to help me with the pronunciation, Hachikar, we had an early settlement of behaviorally modern humans who created these figurines of fertility goddesses. And so this is objective signs of the development and the importance of spirituality, along with science and art at that time. They also had beautiful figural art, decorative art with nice colors. And this is something that we don't see in Neanderthals. They have some primitive art, but not something like this. So that shows you that we can identify three major steps in the development of hominids, from the ability to regulate emotions and habits, to the development of self-directed behavior, and then finally the development of not just self-control, but self-awareness, where you can look inside yourself and assess your own goals and values and determine what you value and what you want to put into action in your life, which leads to the capacity for theory in art and science and spirituality. So I set out some years ago to find objective ways to measure human personality that was based on genetics, biology, neuropsychopharmacology, and brain structure and connectivity, rather than simply making assumptions that we could do factor analyses to identify dimensions. I wanted it to be rooted in biology, psychology, and sociology. And to do that, I had to develop a reliable measuring tool. And so I developed the temperament and character inventory, which is not a measure of just fixed traits, but a measure of the way we learn. And specifically, it's the self plus the internal and the external forces that push and pull us to move in different kinds of directions in adapting to our life. So the best definition of personality is the dynamic organization within the individual. In other words, we're not just observing them from the outside and look at their superficial behavior, but we're looking at the organization within the person, what you would do as a psychotherapist or a psychologist or a psychiatrist, to see how the psychobiological systems are organized, and specifically the systems by which we shape and adapt uniquely to an ever-changing internal and external environment. So this is a very dynamic process. And I developed first a model of the way we organize and regulate our emotions, which is what I define as temperament. Can't see it there. And that involves what's called associative conditioning or procedural learning. That's how you do things. And then a second level is character, which is what we make of ourselves intentionally and creatively. And I developed observations from doing interviews of the different situations in which we adapt with the same motivation, but in different situations. So this involves learning of people in different kinds of situations. And we can distinguish the sensitivity to getting scared, harm avoidance, to avoid getting hurt, novelty seeking with curiosity, and need to explore and understand things that are complex and unfamiliar. Reward dependence, which involves our sensitivity to a smile, to establishing loyal, long-term relationships. And finally, a dimension called persistence that I'll talk about more later. Then we found that just regulating your habits does not predict whether or not you're mature. You can have any combination of these emotional drives and still be mature or immature. And so I had to develop a model of the way we regulate our temperament according to our goals and values. And that's what I call character, and that involves the capacity for developing concepts of who we are. And that includes three aspects. One, within the person, that is being self-directed. A second, how you get along with other people, that is how cooperative are you. And third, whether you recognize that you are part of something larger from which you're inseparable, whether that's your family, your community, nature, the whole universe, and beyond that to the source of the universe. And then these influence each other. Your temperament, your emotions will influence what you notice, how salient it is. But then the meaning that you give to it will modify the way you respond to it. And so there's always this kind of reciprocal interaction. And so whenever you see this kind of bidirectional feedback system, like we have throughout our brain, then you're dealing with a complex system. And that is, you can start with one set of genes and end up in many different places in terms of your behavior. Or you can start out with different genes and end up in the same place. And that makes us complex. And that means that we have to use certain kinds of statistical techniques that I'll show you later in order to uncover the underlying hidden structure. And that understanding is not just done by scientists. Each of us does that. And as we build an idea of who we are and what role we want to take in life, because then we're cultivating our identity to have our habits consistent with our goals and values. So we can measure these reliably, and it is best to decompose it into different expressions of our sensitivity to possible harm in different situations. And so, for example, someone that I describe as high in harm avoidance is someone who's in about the top third of being pessimistic, fearful, shy, and fatigable. Whereas the people who are in the the bottom third, are people who are optimists instead of pessimists, risk takers, daring, brave instead of fearful, outgoing instead of shy, and so on. The people who are in the middle third, you just don't really notice where they are. So you can start to think about, where would I score there? And what about the people I know? That gives you an idea how you can use these descriptors to understand what this trait is. And we can do that for each of them. Novelty seeking involves being impulsive versus being very deliberate and rigid. Reward dependence involves being sentimental, warm, and needing a lot of approval. And then persistence involves being industrious and determined. So that's a map of our emotional structure, but it turns out that we have all of these. We're not just one of those. We have a profile of all of these dimensions of temperament, and so we can construct the cube with harm avoidance, novelty seeking, and reward dependence, in which we see all the possible combinations of being high or low in these. And this gives us a very good description of the different emotional styles that we all have. And these are not necessarily good or bad. These are just differences in our emotional style that we can learn to harness to do what we think is important. We can do the same thing with the character traits of self-directedness, cooperativeness, and self-transcendence. Oh, is this maybe this is what you're telling me? No. Okay. But we can also think of that as a cube. For example, if we're down at the lower right-hand corner, you see the name apathetic, and you see 3 little letters, SCT, which means that person is low in self-directedness, low in cooperativeness, and low in self-transcendence. If you talk to them, you'll see that they describe their life is hard, because they're low in self-directedness. People are mean because they're uncooperative. And they're low in self-transcendence, so then you just die. Life is hard, people are mean, and then you die. Very depressive way of looking at the world. The opposite of that are the people, is what emerged when we became modern Homo sapiens. And instead of looking at challenges as something that makes life hard, we see it as an opportunity to understand more. Instead of seeing people who treat you badly as something that makes life unbearable, you see it as an opportunity to look within yourself and act with compassion and kindness, to build a friend, to make a friend out of an enemy. And instead of thinking that you just die, you think that you feel directly that you're a part of all things from which you're inseparable. And so you want to treat everything with respect and dignity. And there are other combinations, but the organized, down there in the lower back left corner, is the typical Western ideal, and maybe the Freudian ideal. And the top corner, being high in all 3, would be the Sufi and Jungian ideal. The easiest way to think of character, though, is to think of it as to recognize that it involves mental self-government. So there are 3 branches of every government. I used to say that think of your government and think of these as good examples, but now we can think of most of our governments as bad examples. But the executive branch is being self-directed, which means you're resourceful, purposeful, self-accepting, and responsible. And when you reach the ideal, you're self-actualizing. The legislative branch is being cooperative, making the rules so that people can get along with one another. Tolerant, helpful, empathic, principled, and ultimately compassionate. And then the judicial branch is development of insight into the oneness of all things. And that means being idealistic, being self-forgetful, that is not preoccupied with yourself, but just in the flow, and joyful, contemplative, and spiritual. So this is the emergence, essentially, of purposefulness that we saw with the working man, cooperativeness that we saw even in our chimp ancestors, and although not fully, and self-transcendence, which is what emerged in wise man, Homo sapiens. There's another cube in which I deal with the trait of persistence, which serves as a bridge between our emotions and our character. And that enables us then to integrate resiliently and with some plasticity where appropriate, how our emotions get shaped by our goals and our values. So that's the idea that we're not dealing with fixed traits, but something that's dynamic, biopsychosocial, well organized in a way that's universal for all human beings, regardless of culture or environment, although it can be perturbed by traumas and so on. And it's something that involves internal processes of learning and memory. And it's unique to each person because we're all born with different genes, different environmental experiences, and we may develop, depending on resources, different goals and values. So that's how we measure personality at the level of a clinical observation. But what's really striking that people don't quite fully appreciate that now the data has accumulated very strongly that personality is the strongest predictor that we have of the overall level of a person's psychological, physical, social, and spiritual health. Those turn out to be inseparable. They go together in parallel, and the degree to which you're healthy in one of these is strongly related to the degree to which you're healthy in the others. And we can define well-being then as a complete state of physical, mental, social, and spiritual health, as the World Health Organization does. And then we measure it in terms of physical vitality, healthy longevity, in terms of how you're able to think creatively and adaptively in a mature way, and also whether you have pro-social behavior and virtuous behaviors rather than being revengeful and so on. So that means that as our self-directedness, cooperativeness, and self-transcendence increase in strength, we can better regulate our goals and values to be mature and make us successful, and that happens to be associated with an increase in healthy longevity, pro-social behavior, and creativity. And that has been confirmed in countries around the world on all the continents. This is a study that I did in Israel with some Israeli colleagues that shows that above the line that's 0 is average. And then above that are high scores in emotional, physical, and social well-being. And you'll see that those are associated with high scores in 2 or more of the character traits. Whereas if you're low in 1 or 2 of these, you're low overall. So all these aspects go together. And people are often surprised when a psychologist or a psychiatrist talks about spirituality, because we live in such a secular and rationalistic time. But what we've found is objectively, we can show that the trait of self-transcendence is essential path to real health and well-being. And I'm not just talking about being happy and idealistic in a wishful way, but that you have less heart disease, you have less cancer, you have less cardiorespiratory disease, and so on. This really makes a huge difference. And the dynamics of this is driven by how well we're able to let go of fights, how well we can dedicate ourselves to serving other people, and to what extent we can think adaptively and creatively when we're challenged with things that threaten extinction. And these correlations that I list there just show you the consistent contribution of self-transcendence and persistence to both of those processes that allow us to take an outlook on life that's one of unity. All is one is all. Now, so that gives us an idea of what is well-being and how we can measure it objectively. But now I had the task, if I wanted to study the evolutionary biology of this, how could I possibly measure the personality of extinct ancestors? Well, we did studies with whole genome association studies where we had 1 million markers spread over the whole human genome, and we could relate that to individual differences in the temperament and character inventory. And I did this in Finland, then in Korea, and in Germany. And regardless of circumstances, regardless of culture and environmental exposure, we were able to show that the same genes clusters of genes were associated with different temperament and character traits. This shows you kind of a nasty diagram of the complexity of this, because it turns out that individual genes do not operate alone. They work in clusters where you put things together in a way that allows you to have more adaptive functions. And you also notice that there are some red lines that connect where these different clusters share the same single nucleotide polymorphisms, that is, small changes in a single DNA code. And blue lines that show that they don't share genes, but they share people in clusters. And this kind of pattern where you get this complex structure always occurs whenever you have a complex system, as I mentioned, with these feedback relationships. But in any case, what you see is these groups are color-coded for the different profiles of temperament. To make it a little bit easier, I created this cartoon that shows the molecular pathways that are prominent in understanding the individual differences in temperament. And it turns out that there are two cascades in the brain, in the genome, that are extremely important for temperament and account for the vast majority of the variability. These are first messenger systems, a term that will be familiar to all the psychopharmacologists in this system, that respond to external extracellular cues. And this allows us then to adapt to external signals where information then comes to the receptors on the cell surface and then is brought in within the cell. And then the second step is what we see when you move from the chimpanzees to working man, where you have an organized character structure where people are self-directed and cooperative, but they're not self-transcendent. In other words, the current dominant secular model of a healthy personality, which is in DSM-5 and ICD. And here, it's not the first messenger system, but the second messenger system for phosphoinositol calcium signaling. And that means that the adaptive changes occur within the brain. And I'll just give you a sneak preview for what I'm going to show you in a moment. That is, the third step of developing self-awareness only emerges when you have systems that can regulate multicellular organisms and multicellular and multi-organ systems to work collaboratively. And that involves DNA genes that code for and are transcribed to RNA genes that are regulatory. They do not make proteins, they're regulatory genes. So what we then had done is to deconstruct human personality into genetic cascades that are organized as clusters. But we then had the task, we had to reconstruct how temperament and character get integrated to work functionally in a collaborative way, which is what happens with brain functional connectivity. And so what we did first was using the genomic pathways, we looked to see what profiles, joint profiles of temperament and character, how they were organized. And it turned out, to our surprise, but delight at the same time, that they're organized as three nearly separate clusters of people who differ in terms of their genetic networks, first in terms of their phenotypes. We had the creative ones who are also very reliable and unbiased emotionally. We had people who are organized, the Western ideal, and we had a third group that were basically unregulated, highly emotionally reactive, acting irrationally often. And they preferred preferred traditions and little regulation or dependence on someone who would promise to give them what they wanted. And we also showed that these differed in terms of the genes that they had. Both the genes for temperament and character were distinct, and I'll show you that in a minute. And then finally, we were fortunate that we had extensive information from childhood into adulthood about the rearing environments. And the child psychiatrists here will not be surprised to hear that the people who are most likely to develop the creative character is not just those who had particular sets of genes, but also those who were reared with a warm parent and who provided stable direction, love, and caring. And this makes a huge difference in the capacity to express the full human potential for love and hope and faith. So this is just the empirical data, where at the bottom I have the genes, the different clusters of genes that we had identified that explain all the heritable variation in temperament. And then the other vertical axis, we have the clusters of genes that explained all the heritable variability in character traits. And when we mapped those as a matrix, we found that we had three groups: the unregulated in orange, who were basically people with personality disorders; the people in blue, who were the Western ideal working man, organization man, who is self-directed and cooperative but not self-transcendent, will do things if it's for mutual benefit with another person, but will not make sacrifices for others. And then the purple or violet is the creative character, which we now could distinguish either by their genotype, by their phenotype, or by their rearing experiences. And this relationship between the genomic system for measuring them and the phenotypic system for measuring them, and we're doing this work in about 2,000 people, was very strong, so that the relationship is the size of the circle, the green, means that the association is statistically significant at a level of 6 to the minus 52. So it's extremely small, very strong relationship. And as a result of that strength of a relationship, we're able to measure the personality of Neanderthals and chimpanzees using the human genome as a standard for comparison. So what has then emerged is that we have 3 systems of learning and memory that underlie human personality. And I'm going to take a little bit more time. I know I've spoken fast for the other slides, but I want you to really understand this slide because it really is the key to what we've uncovered from many different aspects of human personality. We've identified 3 learning systems: associative conditioning, intentionality, and self-awareness. And these 3 are all present in every human, but they vary in how mature those systems are and how well they're integrated. We can trace when this emerged in evolution from monkeys 41 million years ago to working man 1.8 million years ago to behaviorally modern Homo sapiens 100,000 years ago. We also know the TCI, temperament character inventory profile, that describes it reliably. And we also know the genotypic network, which we labeled so it wouldn't be confusing: emotional reactivity, intentional self-control, and creative self-awareness. And then subsequently, we've also identified the sociological or cultural subtypes that correspond to this. And then you can see that the mechanism for associative conditioning is the habitual response to extracellular stimuli. And then the mechanism for self-control that's intentional is started out with seeking food and then generalized to other goals. But this is a process of adaptation that we can recognize as far back as Homo ergaster, 1.8 million years ago. And then the integrated regulation of the co-expression of genes in different specific regions of the brain that allows different parts of the brain to carry out specialized functions and then to collaborate with other specialized areas is what gives rise to the human connectome, the resting state functional connectivity of the human that is automatically expressed. So we know the molecular process, we know the specific genes, and we know how it's expressed phenotypically, genetically, and so on. Now we're in a position that we could actually study and make comparisons of the learning abilities and personality of chimpanzees, Neanderthals, and modern humans. And we had access to the descriptions of all 3 genomes. And we found that we could then compare to see how many of the 972 genes for human personality that make up these 3 systems of learning and memory were present in chimps and in Neanderthals. Turns out that the chimps had 553 of our 972, and Neanderthals were about halfway between chimps and modern humans. What was most interesting is this bottom column, where we found 272 genes that were only found in modern humans. And we were very interested to know what distinguished us as a species uniquely from these others. And this is a cartoon that shows the number of genes in red there, are the long non-coding RNA genes that are regulatory genes that regulate gene expression and epigenesis and the co-location of certain groups of genes in one place in the brain. These also are expressed, about 70% are expressed in other organs as well. So there's a possibility not only to have collaboration within the brain to account for the human connectome, but also the connections between the brain and all other organs so that we can regulate our health through this way. And you can see that about 46% are long-coding RNAs. The others are pseudogenes, which are genes that were thought to be junk, that had just gotten mutations so they no longer worked anymore. But it turns out that they also have regulatory functions, most of them. Only 5%, this little corner in blue at the top, code for proteins. So remember, probably when half of us were in medical school, we thought that only protein coding genes did anything important. And the rest of the genome was junk. But there are only 20,000 protein coding genes in the human genome, but there's 63,000 genes total. So 43,000 genes are actually having regulatory functions. And they're regulating our gene expression and our epigenetic changes in order for us to be able to adapt in a way that makes us more successful in our adaptation. So I've really said all of this, but what you see just quantitatively is that Neanderthals had 14% of these non-coding RNA genes, and 21% were in humans, but chimps had none of these. So this group of genes is really quite unique. The development of self-control, purposeful self-control, self-directedness, and self-transcendence. Now, it turned out then that we could show that these regulatory RNA genes are nearly all present. They account for most of the genes for self-awareness. And that they are associated with creativity, healthy longevity, and prosocial behavior. So we can say, when I ask, remember the title of this talk is How and Why Did Human Personality Evolve? Well, the how is that self-awareness allows us to develop healthy longevity, to develop prosocial behavior, to be moderate in our expression of our desires, and to have, by identifying with nature, to have more ecological intelligence than we've been showing recently with the activities that we do that are leading to climate change. And that also it promotes creativity and innovation, because we were able to show differences in the longevity of modern humans compared to others, and to show greater longevity in those who are expressing this dominantly, the creative cluster. And then, so that's the way we can do it. We can show differences between our ancestors and us, and we can show differences within modern humans in terms of how well they're expressing these clusters of genes for the individual 3 systems of learning and memory. Now, it's also useful to point out that we're still a young, wise species, and we're not fully down the path of the cultivation of wisdom as we see in the world today. And it's important then to understand what it is that we need to modify in our societies in order to be able to improve our insight and to live in a more adaptive way. And so we know that the things that impair self-awareness and therefore impair health and modify the way we express our genes are increasing harm avoidance, like with things like fear, stress, and terrorism, general instability. We decrease self-directedness whenever we're exposed to an emphasis on loss of autonomy and disinformation. And we decrease our capacity for resilience and persistence in doing things that are challenging and difficult or discouraging when we see too much social inequity, exploitation, and so on, which tends to make people distrustful of others. Now, that's what we can show within modern humans, but we can also show that Neanderthals were less prosocial than modern humans, because it turns out that they tended to inbreed, And they didn't exchange mates between even different tribes of Neanderthals. Now, we know that there's some interbreeding even between Neanderthals and modern humans, so that we have some Neanderthal genes, but likely that comes from, raping and pillaging, and perhaps some, voluntary interbreeding. But the real characteristic that distinguishes everything about the genetics of Neanderthals from us is that they lived in small bands of about 12, 1 or 2 dozen people, 12 to 25 people. And that meant that they didn't exchange genes with other tribes of Neanderthals. So they were not able, they could work with one another within the tribe, but they didn't play with other tribes well. So they were highly tribal. So that tells us how we evolved adaptive characteristics like creativity, healthy longevity, and prosocial behavior. But what made that selected for? Why did this evolve in this way? And the best hypothesis for that is that we took advantage of the fact that we were living longer lives, and that from those who survived to be grandparents, they could look after their grandchildren and their children. And in addition, even if they weren't related biologically, they could look after other members of their community and make the community a healthier place in which people had the conditions in which they could live up to their capacity. And we've been able to show that that is that there was positive selection for longevity and self-awareness and creativity. And we show that at the molecular level because the promoters of the expression of the regulatory RNA genes was on the promoters, and more so than on the exons of those genes. So that's what you see when there's a regulatory function. And that's now widely been confirmed that the long non-coding RNA genes are regulatory genes from many studies in subhuman animals. So let me summarize my findings that I've told you. Humans have these 3 systems of learning and memory, and I'm going to skip a little bit of this in order to get to the discussion part, but that those get integrated. The temperament and the character get integrated by being self-directed, cooperative, and self-transcendent. And that we know that this kind of complex system from studies in molecular biology that I'll discuss more on Tuesday when I give that talk, involve complex multimodular systems like we have in the human connectome or the brain connective system. And as a result of this, when we try to reduce psychopathology to categorical disorders, we're grossly oversimplifying what's actually happening within us at a molecular and a biological and physiological level. And as a result of that, we're handicapping ourselves by just thinking of there being rather fixed circuits that we can target by hitting 1 or 2 receptors, when in fact these complex circuits involve thousands of genes and multiple thousands of regulatory genes. So how then should psychopharmacology adapt itself in the 21st century to the post-genomic revolution that we face when we try to regulate and treat people with phenomena that are based on very complex neurobiological systems? So what I would do is to tell you that self-awareness turns out to be crucial for the regulation of gene expression and epigenesis, which is the mediating factor between the genome and the expression of genes in a way that's adaptive. So take a moment to reflect on the ways that medications that we prescribe and the psychotherapies that we do are most helpful and ways in which they are not effective. What are their roles in promoting health and in treating disease? How important is the therapeutic alliance to the patient, with the patient? How should we be combining psychotherapy with physical, interventional, person-centered, and experiential therapies? And would it be more beneficial for our patients and for our own well-being to address this by integrating these different aspects of treatment in order to make our experience of being providers of mental health more meaningful and satisfying rather than exposing ourselves to professional burnout, which is so common now. And finally, let me just stop then with the fact that I think is the most important, and that is that what most distinguishes modern human beings from our ancestors is our plasticity, our capacity to change, our self-awareness, which helps us to understand what would be meaningful and satisfying, and our capacity for creative adaptation to the existential crises that we face today. We did this before 100,000 years ago when we became behaviorally modern humans. We faced many near bottlenecks that wiped out the humans along the path between then and now. The question is really whether we're going to use our foresight and self-awareness to do that now. And I think the people here who are interested in this would be the kind of person and be in a position to do that. Thank you.